Good afternoon, children. The last three parts what all we discussed in a nutshell I have written on the board. Just a brief review of what was taught to you in the earlier classes. Then we will proceed on to I will be teaching to you today about abolition of slavery in the revolution, the French Revolution, and how it affected the everyday life in France. So that is the last aspect in the French Revolution. So to recall what we have learned in the earlier classes, in the earlier four parts of our French Revolution, the first part dealt with how the French society was during the late 18th century. We saw how we had the estates, how it was divided into three parts, as the first estate, second estate and the third estate. So in detail we have dealt in all the earlier parts. The second part told you about the outbreak of revolution, how the constitution was drafted by the National Assembly. Then we spoke about how France becomes a constitutional monarchy. Then the constitution of 1791 was vested with the powers to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. We discussed about the active citizens and passive citizens. Okay, then the next aspect was France abolished monarchy and it becomes a republic. Then the reign of terror under Maximilian Robespierre. Then a directory which ruled France, and because of political instability, what happened? It paved way for the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. He ruled France. Then later on, we also saw the role of women in the French Revolution, how the political clubs were formed and how schooling was made compulsory for the girls, how divorce was legalized, how marriage was, these are certain things what we discussed. How marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely and registered under the civil law, how women could train for jobs and they could become artists or run small businesses. When did they get the political rights? What was the main, what did the women demand? They wanted same political rights as men. So finally, when did they get? In the year 1947, the women in France won the right to what we saw there in the last part. Now today we will discuss about how the abolition of slavery. Now one of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime. In the reign of terror under Maximilian Robespierre, he spoke about the role of Jacobin clubs, isn't it so? So what was the reform which was brought about was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. Now the colonies in the Caribbean, what were they? The Martinique, the Guadeloupe, the San Domingo, these were important suppliers of commodities to the European markets. What were they? The commodities were tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. But what happened was that Europeans were reluctant to go and work in the distant lands, unfamiliar lands. So what happened? There was shortage of labor on the plantations. So this was met by, how was this shortage met? There was a slave trade between Europe, Africa and the America. Now what happened? The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants, they sailed from the port of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast. What did they do? They brought slaves to the local chieftains, they branded and shackled them. These slaves were packed tightly into ships for a 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands. Now what happened? These people were sold to the plantation owners. Now the exploitation of slave labor, it made it possible to meet the growing demands of the European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes, they owned the merchants who lived there, they owned their economic prosperity due to the flourishing slave trade. Then what happened? Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. But the National Assembly also held long debates about whether the rights of man. We read about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens earlier. So whether this also should be extended to these slaves, to these all the French subjects, including those who were in the colonies. But he did not pass any laws. Why? Because he feared opposition from the businessmen, whose incomes depended on the slave trade. Now it was finally the convention which in 1794 it legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. So this was the major revolutionary social reform brought about by the Jacobin regime. Now this however turned out to be a short-term measure. Why? Because after 10 years later, Napoleon again he reintroduced slavery. The plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. So slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in the year 1848. Now moving on, the next aspect deals with the revolution and the everyday life. What was the impact of this French Revolution in the lives of the French people? Now the years following 1789, we have seen in a period of 10 years what all changes have taken place in France. Now the years following in 1789 in France, it saw many such changes in the lives of men, women and children. The revolutionary governments, they took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of what? Liberty and equality. So these how they were put into practice in the everyday life. Now one important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille. Okay, we read about when we started the discussion, started about the fourth Bastille, which was hated by the people because it stood for the despotic rule of the king, the oppressive rule of the king. Now the important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. What do you mean by censorship? It is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of a book or a film or news that are considered to be politically unacceptable or which are a threat to the security of a nation. So now what happened was during the old regime, all the written material and any cultural activities, books, newspapers, plays, they could be published or performed only after they had been approved. They needed the approval by the censors of the king. If it was something which was against the monarchy, then it would not be published. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it proclaimed what? Freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. So, you cannot take away this freedom of speech. So, now newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures, they flooded the towns of France from where they travelled rapidly into the countryside. Now, they all described and discussed what all was happening in France. So, people were aware of what was going on. Now, freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Some may be for, some may be against. Now, each side, they sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Now, plays, songs and festive processions, they attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and they could identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in text. So we read about, we discussed about John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, these people, how they took forward these ideals of liberty and equality. Now, those days, many of these people were not educated. Now, print helped them to know these plays and festives. They made them understand how important are these ideals. So, what happened? So see, they help the people to relate to their everyday life. Now, moving on, here there is a figure where Marat, he is addressing the people. This is a painting by Louis Leopold Boigny. Now, who was this Jean-Paul Marat? He was a French political theorist, physician and scientist. He was a journalist and a politician during the French Revolution. He was a vigorous defender of the sans-culottes and he was seen as a radical voice. Now, his death, one of the images which was painted during this French Revolution also told how he participated in the French Revolution. In the year 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, what did he do? He crowned himself as the Emperor of France. And what did he do? He set about to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties, and he created kingdoms where his family members were placed. Now, Napoleon saw his role as modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures. He provided by the decimal system. Now, initially, many people, what did they think? They thought that Napoleon is going to liberate us from this autocratic rule of the kings. Now, he would bring freedom for the people. But soon what happened was, Napoleonic armies, they came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. Now, later on, we will discuss in your 10th class, again you have nations in Europe, where we will be discussing more in detail about what are the administrative Napoleonic code of law, that was all we will be discussing. Now what happened was he was finally defeated at Waterloo in the year 1815. So many of his measures that carried out the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe, it had a great impact on the people even though Napoleon had left. Now these ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the liberty and democratic rights. These are the important legacy of the French Revolution, which spread to many parts of Europe. Okay, now these spread from France to rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized people, they revoked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. From India also you have Tipu Sultan and Raja Raman Roy who were influenced. They responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Now, what exactly, how this French Revolution impacted? What was its impact? It led to the emancipation of the individual, a greater division of the landed property. It helped in the abolition of privileges by birth, established equality. Globally, it became the focal point for development of what most modern political ideologies, like it led to the spread of liberalism, and then nationalism, secularism, etc. It also accelerated the rise of what democracies and republics. Now the values and the institutions of this revolution which took place in France, it dominates French politics even to this day. Now many historians, what do they regard? They regard that this French Revolution as one of the most important events in the human history. So please go through the lesson, read the lesson, watch all the 4 parts, then you will be able to follow what exactly happened in France during the late 18th century, what all changes took place because of the participation of the people. Thank you, children.